The Grand Forum on Station Kahalis was older than wheat, older than fire, if you measured by Earth years. The ceiling stretched so high that clouds formed inside it, real clouds, engineered by the Tesari 8,000 years ago because they liked the way moisture carried sound. Every surface was carved from a mineral that no human had a name for, something between glass and bone. And when the light hit it right, the whole chamber hummed like a tuning fork the size of a cathedral. Yun Teho walked into this place with 5 people behind him and a borrowed translation device clipped to his collar. 6 humans, the smallest delegation in the history of the Galactic Council. The Tesari delegation alone filled an entire wing of the station, 412 representatives, each one a specialized harmonic node in their hive communication network. The Moravi had brought a fleet escort of 90 ships just to park in orbit while their diplomats talked. The Palic delegate, Warden Thren, did not sit in his designated seat. The seat existed under him, the way a napkin exists under a boulder. Teho's delegation had arrived on a Moravi freight hauler, cargo class. They'd shared the hold with 600 tons of dried kelp bound for a Valesi agricultural colony. He stepped to the speaker's platform. It had been designed for beings between 2 and 4 meters tall. Teho was 173 centimeters. A small shelf extended from the base, the kind of accommodation you build for a child visiting an adult's office. He stood on the shelf. He did not adjust his posture or clear his throat, or do any of the small nervous things that most species did when they addressed the forum for the first time. He smiled. It was a warm smile, the kind that made you think of someone's favorite uncle, and every alien species in the room read it as something different. The Tesari read submission. The Palic read nothing, because the Palic did not care about faces. None of them read it correctly. Teho opened his tablet and read Earth's formal application for Provisional Council membership. The translation device did its best, but it was a Moravi commercial model built for trade negotiations, not diplomacy. It stripped the Korean honorifics. It flattened the register. What Teho had written as a careful, layered address that honored the age and dignity of every species present came out sounding like a man ordering noodles at a counter. He finished reading. He placed the tablet down. He smiled again and waited. 3 seconds of silence. 3 seconds was a long time in the Grand Forum. Treaties had been sealed in less. Then Speaker Olen began to vibrate. Olen was 900 years old. His carapace had been polished so many times that it was nearly translucent. And when he vibrated, when he laughed, the harmonics traveled through the mineral walls, and the engineered clouds, and the ancient carved floor, and the entire chamber rang with it. Wind chimes in a hurricane. That was what Tesari laughter sounded like. It spread. The Moravi shifted colors, a rolling wave of turquoise and amber that meant amusement, the deep kind. The kind you felt when a small animal did something brave and pointless. Trade Lord Cussin's 4 hearts pumped in visible rhythm beneath his translucent chest, each one flushing a darker shade of satisfaction. The Palic did nothing. But for the Palic, doing nothing in a moment that called for reaction was the reaction. Warden Thren's silence was the loudest laughter in the room. They were laughing because the numbers were the numbers. Humanity had no faster-than-light travel. They had hitchhiked to this station. Their home fleet was 18 ships. 18. The Moravi had 18,000. Humanity's entire gross planetary product, every factory, every farm, every mine, every server, every single unit of economic output their species had ever generated, was less than what the Tesserae spent annually on the ceremonial dust they used to polish their dead. 18 ships, ceremonial dust. The math was the math. Teho stood on his little shelf and let them finish. Speaker Olen delivered the council's decision with the gentleness of a doctor explaining gravity to someone who had just tried to fly. Provisional observation status. not membership. Humanity could watch, they could attend sessions, they could take notes. They could not vote, could not trade independently, could not settle beyond their home star system without a patron species to supervise them. The word he used, patron, translated into Korean as something close to guardian, the kind of word you use for children or pets. Taeho nodded through all of it. His smile did not change. When Olen finished, Taeho asked one question. What is the process for reclassification? Olen listed the criteria. Military capability above a threshold defined by the Palic War Index. Economic output measured against the Moravi trade baseline. Technological contribution assessed by the Tesserae Innovation Registry. Cultural exchange programs vetted by a joint committee. Each metric was calibrated with the precision of a species that had been running this system for millennia. The math worked out to roughly 300 years of sustained development before a new species could qualify. He wrote something on his tablet. A date. 14 months from today. He did not show anyone. He thanked the speaker, thanked the council, stepped down from his shelf, and walked out with his 5 people behind him. The laughter followed them down the corridor. It followed them into the docking tube. It followed them all the way back to the freight hauler that smelled like dried kelp. 9 hours later, aboard the Baekdu, humanity's flagship, the nicest of their 18 ships, which was not saying much, Taeho sat in his quarters and opened a secure channel to Earth. Admiral Baek Somi's face appeared on the screen. She had the kind of face that gave away nothing, a face like a locked door with no handle on the outside. How did it go? She asked. They laughed. A pause, the kind that had weight to it. The kind you could stub your toe on. Good, Somi said. She closed the channel. In the grand forum, the engineered clouds drifted along the ancient ceiling, and the mineral walls still hummed faintly with the residue of Tessari laughter. And in the upper gallery, in the section reserved for the Idari, the oldest known beings in the galaxy, the ones who observed and rarely spoke, the seat was empty. It had been empty for 40 years. Kwon Ji-hak did not look like a man who was about to change the galactic economy. He looked like a man who had slept in his clothes for 3 days, which he had, and who had eaten nothing but protein paste and black coffee for a week, which he also had. His hair stuck up on one side. There was a grease stain on his collar that had been there so long it had developed what he privately called character. He sat across from a Valesi trade delegate in a room the size of a closet on the lower levels of Station Kahalis, the levels where the air recyclers worked a little too hard, and everything smelled faintly of copper. The Valesi were small, knee-height to a human, with 6 arms and faces like crumpled paper. Their delegate's name was impossible to pronounce correctly, so Ji-hak called her ma'am, and she seemed fine with it. He slid a data chip across the table. Agricultural Optimization Suite, he said. Soil analysis, crop rotation modeling, water distribution mapping. It learns your terrain in about 40 hours and starts making recommendations. The Valesi delegate picked up the chip with 2 of her 6 hands. What does it cost? 40 tons of refined lithium and access to your atmospheric data for calibration. She stared at him. The Moravi charged 6 times that for a basic agricultural consult, and their systems didn't learn anything. They just applied a standard template and billed you for adjustments. Why? She asked. Ji-hak shrugged. The shrug was genuine. The price was not. It was precisely calculated to be low enough that the Valesi would talk about it. They did. Within 2 months, the Valesi grain output tripled, not doubled, tripled. The algorithm had found inefficiencies in their irrigation network that 6,000 years of Valesi farming had missed. Not because the Valesi were stupid, but because the inefficiencies were too small to see individually, and too interconnected to see collectively without a system that could hold all of them in mind at once. Word spread the way word always spreads, among the small and the overlooked. Quietly, through back channels, through the kitchen table networks of species that didn't have lobbyists or fleet escorts, or seats in the lower gallery. By the 6th month, 9 species were running human-designed optimization algorithms. Logistics, agriculture, energy distribution, medical supply chains. Each package was different. Each one was cheap. Each one worked better than it had any right to. The numbers were small. A 3% efficiency gain here, a 7% reduction in waste there. Nothing that would make headlines on Chehalis. Nothing that the major species would notice in their quarterly economic summaries. But 9 species, each running a few percentage points better. Each quietly grateful. Each remembering who had offered and what it had cost. That was not an economic strategy. That was a foundation. Na Unji built the rest. She was the kind of person who could sit in a room for 2 hours before anyone realized she was there. Not because she was hiding, because she was still. She had a gift for stillness that made her blend into the furniture of any species' living space, and she used it the way a hunter uses a blind. Not to ambush, but to listen. She learned languages, not through the translation devices that every council species relied on, by hand, by sitting in the quarters of minor species delegates, and drinking whatever they drank, fermented sap with the Valesi, a thick mineral broth with the Dreni, something that tasted like battery acid with the Heishi, which she drank with a straight face, and later described in her private notes as regrettable but politically necessary. She learned their greetings and their insults, and the small words they used when they were tired, the ones that didn't translate because they were too specific to a body that humans didn't have, or a sensation that humans didn't feel. She learned them anyway, and she asked them questions, not about politics, not about alliances, not about how they would vote on anything. She asked them about their homes, their children, their food, the things they missed about their planets, the parts of the station that made them uncomfortable. The last time anyone in the council had asked them anything at all. That last question always landed the same way. A pause, a recalibration, a slow recognition that the answer was never. 13 species. Individually they were footnotes. The council's procedural rules assigned them voting weight based on a formula that factored in military tonnage, economic output, and territorial reach. By that math, each of them carried the voting power of a rounding error. But there were 13 of them, and rounding errors, stacked carefully, could move a decimal point. Yunji never told them this. She didn't need to. She just kept showing up, kept asking, kept drinking the battery acid. Meanwhile, on Earth's moon, something was happening behind the walls of a research facility that had been built 3 years before humanity ever made contact with the wider galaxy. The facility's original purpose was listed in public records as advanced propulsion research, which was true in the way that calling an ocean some water was true. Baek Somi oversaw the project. She visited every 11 days, arriving on an unmarked shuttle, spending 14 hours inside, and leaving without speaking to anyone who didn't already have clearance. Supply convoys to the facility had tripled since the council session. Power consumption had passed Seoul's 6 weeks ago. 2 of the supply manifests were sealed at a classification level that technically didn't exist. Somi had invented the clearance tier herself, because the existing ones didn't go high enough. Jihawk commuted between Chehalis and the lunar facility every 9 days. He slept on the shuttle. He slept in the facility. It was not clear that he slept at all in between. The grease stain on his collar had been joined by 2 more. He did not notice. Taeho, for his part, continued to attend council sessions. He sat in the observation gallery with his tablet and his smile, and took notes. He asked polite questions during the open comment period, the segment of each session that existed for minor species to voice concerns that would be dutifully recorded and never read. He asked about trade regulations, import tariffs, navigation corridor licensing, maintenance protocols for shared infrastructure, the kind of questions that made delegates' eyes glaze over, the kind no one remembered afterward. Each answer gave him one more piece of the machine, 7 months after the laughter, Warden Thren of the Palak sent a classified report to his government's central command, the Home Corps. It was brief. Thren did not waste words. Words for the Palak were heavy things, and you didn't throw them around. The report said, the humans are not behaving like a pre-industrial curiosity. Recommend increased observation. The Home Corps received the report, filed it, did not act on it. Thren, in his quarters on Cahalis, sat in the dark and felt the weight of his own warning settle into his joints like calcium deposits. He was old for a Palak. He had fought in 3 wars and brokered the peace after 2 of them. He knew what preparation looked like when it was dressed in ordinary clothes. He also knew that nobody listened to warnings about small things until the small things were no longer small. In the upper gallery of the Grand Forum, the Idhari seat remained empty. It had been empty for 40 years. But twice in the last month, the environmental sensors in that section of the gallery had registered a faint thermal signature, there and gone, like a candle flame reflected in glass. The station's maintenance crew logged it as a sensor error. Rath Station sat at the intersection of 3 shipping lanes like a cork floating where rivers met. It was not beautiful. It was not important. It was the kind of place that existed because someone had to exist there. A waypoint, a refueling dock, a place where long-haul freighter crews could stretch their legs and eat something that hadn't been freeze-dried for 6 months. 12 species had citizens on board when the Krev arrived. The Krev were not an army. They were not a civilization. They were barely a species in any meaningful sense of the word. They were biological ships, living organisms the size of buses that traveled in swarms and stripped space stations for organic material, the way locusts stripped fields. No intelligence, no malice, just hunger moving through vacuum in a cloud of chitinous bodies and acid-tipped tendrils. The swarm that hit Reth Station was mid-sized, enough to eat through the station's outer hull in 9 hours, and consume every organic thing inside. Food stores, atmospheric plants, people, in 6. The station's emergency beacon fired. The signal reached Cahalis in 40 minutes. Speaker Olen convened a rapid response consultation. Trade Lord Cusson calculated fleet mobilization times. 11 days. That was the standard. The nearest Moravi patrol fleet was 11 days out. The Tisari could send a defense swarm in 9, but their defense swarms needed 2 days to calibrate to a new threat pattern before engagement. Reth Station had 6 hours. Olen did what the council always did when the math didn't work. He expressed formal regret. He ordered the beacon signal archived for memorial purposes. He began drafting the compensation framework for the 12 species who were about to lose citizens. Acceptable losses. The Tisari had a formula for it. You couldn't run a galaxy without one. The Bekdu was 9 hours away. Bek Somi received a beacon relay in her quarters aboard the ship, where she had been reading a report on hull stress tolerances that Jihawk had flagged as mildly terrifying. She put the report down. She opened the ship-wide channel. All stations, course correction to Reth, full burn. Her navigation officer, a young woman named Shah Mireille, who had been on the Bekdu for 3 months, and still flinched every time the Admiral spoke directly to her, looked at the star charts, looked at the engine specifications. Admiral, at maximum rated output, we're 9 hours and 14 minutes. I didn't say rated output. She closed the channel. Down in the engine room, Quan Jihak heard the order and felt something in his chest that was halfway between excitement and the sensation you get when you realize the roller coaster you're on was not inspected recently. He pulled up the engine interface. The new one. The one he'd built in the lunar facility. The one that wasn't in any manual, because no manual existed for it yet. The engine was based on a principle that the Council's physicists would have called impossible, and that Jihak called theoretically aggressive. It folded space not in the clean, elegant way that Tasari drives did, but in a brute force compression that shoved the ship through dimensions it was not technically invited into. The process was loud. The process was hot. 2 of the 3 backup cooling systems were running on patches that Jihawk had written during a shuttle nap. He engaged the drive. The Bekdu screamed through folded space like a stone skipping across a pond that didn't want to be skipped on. Every panel in the engine room rattled. Every bolt vibrated at a frequency that Jihawk felt in his teeth. A coolant line burst on Deck 4. A secondary power coupling fused itself into a shape that would later require a welding torch and a prayer to remove. They arrived at Reth Station in 4 hours and 6 minutes. The Krev swarm had already begun its approach, a dark, shifting cloud against the stars, each organism pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that served no purpose except to make them look like the nightmares of every species that had ever encountered them. They moved like a flock of birds, if birds were the size of transit buses and wanted to eat your bones. Somi stood on the bridge and looked at the swarm through the main display. 1,100 organisms. The Bekdu carried weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat, pulse cannons, kinetic accelerators, 2 torpedo bays. Against a fleet of enemy warships, they were adequate. Against 1,100 dispersed biological targets that moved independently and reformed around any gap you punched in their formation, they were a garden hose aimed at a forest fire. She did not try to fight the swarm. She turned to Jihak, who had come up from the engine room with coolant on his hands and a protein bar in his teeth. "The herding algorithm," she said. "Is it ready? Define ready. Will it work?" "It will almost certainly work." "Almost certainly. I'd bet my lunch on it. This is my lunch." Somi looked at the protein bar. She looked at the swarm. She made a decision that would be studied in military academies on 14 planets for the next 200 years. Run it. The algorithm was the thing that mattered. Not the weapons, not the engine, the algorithm. Human AI architecture was not smarter than what the Council species had built. It was not more powerful. It was more adaptive. Council species had banned true artificial intelligence centuries ago, and in doing so, they had also abandoned the research pathways that led to systems capable of real-time recursive learning. Their targeting systems were precise but static. They calculated, fired, recalculated, fired again. Each cycle took a fraction of a second. Against conventional threats, fractions of a second were enough. Against 1,100 organisms that moved like a murmuration of starlings on methamphetamine, fractions of a second were an eternity. The Bekdu system didn't calculate and fire. It predicted. It watched the swarm's movement for 12 seconds. 12 seconds that felt on the bridge like 12 years. And then it understood the swarm the way a shepherd understands sheep. Not individually, as a flow. The ship began to move. Not toward the swarm, around it, through the gaps in it. The Bekdu fired its weapons not to kill, but to redirect. A pulse here, a kinetic round there. Each one placed not where a Krev organism was, but where it was about to be. Each shot was a nudge, a suggestion, a fence post in an invisible corral. 11,000 micro-corrections per second. The ship's AI made each one faster than any living navigator could process the data that informed it. The Krebs swarm, organism by organism, began to turn. Not away from Reth Station, toward a debris field. The remains of an old mining platform that had been abandoned decades ago, still orbiting in a slow metallic cloud. Dead metal, organic material stripped long ago, but the Krebs sensory apparatus couldn't distinguish at this range. They smelled matter. They followed it. The herding took 47 minutes. During those 47 minutes, Jihawk sat on the engine room floor and ate his protein bar and monitored the cooling systems, and did not think about what would happen if the algorithm's prediction model drifted by more than 0.3%, because thinking about that would not help, and the protein bar was almost good. The swarm hit the debris field. Dead metal wasn't nutritious, but by the time they figured that out, they were deep enough into the field that their swarm cohesion had broken. Individual organisms scattered. The threat dissolved. Reth Station survived. All 12 species citizens. Every single one. The council convened an emergency session. The grand forum was full, but the sound was different now. The engineered clouds above seemed thinner. The harmonic walls carried no laughter. Speaker Olen addressed Tejo directly, which was itself a break in protocol. Observation status species were addressed through intermediaries. Ambassador. The Baekdu was listed as 9 hours from Reth Station. You arrived in 4. Explain. Tejo stood on his little shelf. He smiled. We were in the neighborhood. Nobody laughed. Trade Lord Cussen's 4 hearts were all pumping the same color now, a deep, bruised violet that the Moravi themselves associated with threat assessment. The engine specifications, he said. We require full technical disclosure. Of course, Tejo said. We would be happy to discuss technology sharing with our fellow council members. Once we are fellow council members. The session ended without resolution. The delegates filed out in the heavy, measured way that beings move when they are rethinking load-bearing assumptions about the universe. In the upper gallery, the Adhari seat was no longer empty. Something sat there. Something made of light that was not quite light. A presence that flickered at the edge of perception, like a word you almost remembered. It had not been there at the start of the session. No one had seen it arrive. Every species in the room registered the flicker. Every species felt the temperature of the chamber shift by a fraction of a degree. None of them could say what it meant. But the laughter was gone, and in the silence it left behind, something else was growing. The morning of the vote, Yun Tejo put on a clean shirt. This was unusual. Not that he was generally dirty, he was a neat man by habit. But he had worn the same rotation of 3 shirts for 23 months, without ever seeming to notice which one he had on. Na Unji noticed the clean shirt, because noticing things was what Unji did, the way breathing was what lungs did. And she understood that the shirt was not about appearance. It was armor, the soft kind. The kind you put on when the day is going to cost you something and you want to meet it dressed. Tejo walked into the grand forum at exactly the scheduled time. Not early, not late. He carried his tablet. He stepped onto the little shelf. He smiled. I invoke Article 9 Gamma, he said. Exceptional contribution to galactic stability. I petition for full membership on behalf of the United Earth Government. The chamber rustled. With the sound of 400 delegates reaching for their reference terminals at the same time. Because Article 9 Gamma was so old that most of them had never heard of it. It existed in the Foundational Charter, a clause written by the Adhari themselves, back when the Adhari still wrote things, that allowed a species to bypass standard development metrics if it could demonstrate an extraordinary and irreplaceable contribution to the stability of the galactic community. Speaker Olen's carapace shifted color, a deep amber. Concern for a Tessari. He was 900 years old, and he had not heard Article 9 Gamma invoked in his lifetime. He pulled up the text. He read it. He read it again. The clause was valid. The petition was properly filed. A vote was required. The council will vote, Olen said. His harmonics were flat. No music in them. Full membership requires a 2/3 supermajority. The math, as always, was the math. The 5 major species, Tessari, Moravi, Palak, Idhari, and the Hareni, controlled enough weighted votes to block any motion they collectively opposed. And the motion they were being asked to approve was the elevation of a species that had arrived on a kelp freighter less than 2 years ago. Olen was not worried. The math was the math. The 5 major species voted first. as protocol demanded. Tasari, no. Moravi, no. Palak, no. Hareni, no. Abstain. The abstention rippled through the chamber like a crack in ice. The Idhari had not voted on anything in 40 years. Abstention was not the same as absence. Abstention was presence. Abstention was the Idhari sitting in the room and choosing deliberately to not say no. But it did not matter. 4 of the 5 major species had voted against. A supermajority was impossible without at least 3 major species voting yes. And even then you'd need. The minor species began to vote. Valesi, yes. Dreni, yes. Heishi, yes. Olen's harmonics stuttered, a small sound like a bell with a crack in it. Toren, yes. Halesi, yes. Bakuri, yes. Trade Lord Cusson shifted in his tank. The violet deepened. Oseni, yes. Karathi, yes. Movali, yes. 13 minor species, one after another, each one casting a vote that individually weighed almost nothing. Rounding errors. Decimal dust. The kind of voting power that the Council's weighted system had been specifically designed to make irrelevant. And behind the 13, 2 mid-tier species, the Savani and the Relketh, whose economies had been running on human optimization algorithms for 6 months, and who had watched their trade deficits reverse for the first time in a century. They voted yes. And behind those 2, the Laresi, a species that had lost 40 citizens on Reth Station and gotten every single one of them back because a human ship had done something impossible. Laresi, yes. The count crossed 2/3 by a single vote. The Grand Forum went silent. Not the dramatic kind, not the cinematic intake of breath. This was the silence of 400 minds hitting the same wall at the same time. The wall of a number that could not be what it was, and yet was. Every delegate ran the math again. The math did not change. The math could not change, because the math had never included the variables that mattered. Nobody had counted the minor species. They were background noise. They were the static between the signals. The entire architecture of the Council's power structure was built on the assumption that the small could be safely ignored, because the small could never coordinate. Nobody had considered that someone might ask the small what they needed. Trade Lord Cusson broke the silence. All 4 of his hearts were pumping at combat rhythm now, each one a different shade of violet so deep it was nearly black. This vote is invalid, he said. The minor delegations were coerced. The word coerced landed in the chamber and sat there like a stain. The Valesi ambassador rose. Her name was unpronounceable by human or Moravi vocal apparatus, and she stood on a platform that raised her to the height of the speaker's podium, which still only brought her to chest level on most of the other delegates. She had 6 arms, and she folded all of them. We were asked. She let that sit. The humans came to our quarters. They learned our language, not through a machine, by mouth. They sat with us. They drank our tea. A pause. Our tea is not good. They drank it anyway. Something shifted in the chamber. Not a sound, a weight. They asked us what we needed. They listened to the answer. Then they helped. She unfolded 2 of her arms, the gesture, in Valesi body language, that meant, I am telling you something you should already know. You have been here for 8,000 years. You never asked us anything. The silence that followed was not the computational silence of before. It was older. It was the silence of a room full of ancient, powerful beings, realizing that they had been weighed on a scale they didn't know existed, and found light. Cusson opened his mouth to respond. Olen raised a forelimb, the Tasari gesture for procedural authority. The vote stands, Olen said. His harmonics were thin. Unless a formal challenge is filed with supporting evidence within 1 cycle. No one filed a challenge, not because there was no desire to, but because Cusson's accusation of coercion had been answered by a being 1/3 his size, who had folded all 6 arms and said a sentence that could not be argued with. Then the Idari spoke. The Idari representative, the flickering presence in the upper gallery, the being made of light that was not light, emitted a single pulse. It was not sound. It was not electromagnetic radiation in any frequency the forum's instruments could categorize. It was something older, something that traveled through the mineral walls and the engineered clouds and the bones of every being in the room. And each species heard it, in their own language, in their own voice, in the part of their mind where certainty lived. One word. The Tessari heard it as a harmonic that meant correct timing. The Moravi heard a tonal shift that meant debt fulfilled. The Palic felt a vibration in their calcium lattice that meant weight balanced. The closest human translation, the one that appeared on Teho's borrowed Moravi device, delayed by 3 full seconds as the software tried to find a word that fit, was overdue. One word, after 40 years of silence. One word that validated the vote and indicted the voters, and said, without saying, that the oldest eyes in the galaxy had been watching, and what they had seen was a room full of powerful beings who had forgotten how to count. Teho stood on his shelf. His tablet was in his hand. The screen showed the date he had written 14 months ago. Today's date, the one he had never shown to anyone. The one that Somi had said, good to, in a voice that carried the weight of a plan already in motion. He closed the tablet. He smiled, but it was a different smile now. Not the uncle smile, not the warm one. This one had architecture behind it. This one had foundations and load-bearing walls and a view from the top floor that looked out over a galaxy that had just changed shape. The forum adjourned. The delegates left in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because the things they needed to say required new vocabulary. And the old words, the words built for a galaxy where 18 ships was a joke, and dried kelp was a punchline, those words didn't work anymore. In the corridor outside the forum, Yunji was waiting. She stood against the wall, with her arms crossed, and her face showing nothing, which for Unji was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Teho walked past her. He said nothing. She fell into step beside him. They walked in silence back to the docking tube, past the lower levels where the air recyclers worked too hard, past the closet-sized room where G-Hack had traded a data chip for lithium and started a revolution so quiet that it sounded like math. Behind them, the Grand Forum's mineral walls were still humming, but the frequency had changed. The galaxy waited for humanity to be loud. Every species that had ever gained power in the history of the Council had followed the same pattern. You won your seat, and then you used it. You made demands. You claimed territory. You renegotiated trade agreements with your new weight on the scale. You flexed, because flexing was what power was for, and the other species understood flexing. They had frameworks for it, protocols, countermoves already loaded and waiting. Humanity did not flex. Teho sent a message to each of the 5 major species delegations. Not a broadcast, not a forum address. A private message, individual, addressed by name. Each one said the same thing. I would like to meet with you. In your quarters, at your convenience. I will come alone. The requests arrived and sat in inboxes like small, polite bombs. Cusson read his, and changed color 3 times in 4 seconds. Olen read his, and vibrated at a frequency his aides had never heard before. Something between confusion and the Tessari equivalent of an itch you couldn't reach. Warden Thren read his, and sat in the dark for an hour, turning the words over, the way you'd turn a stone that might be a fossil or might be an egg. Teho visited each of them. He went to Cusson's quarters first, a pressurized aquatic suite, where the trade lord floated in mineral-rich water, and conducted business through a membrane that separated his environment from the oxygen-based corridor outside. Teho stood on the dry side of the membrane and talked to a shadow behind blue-green glass. He did not bring a tablet. He did not bring terms. He asked Kusan what the Moravi needed. The question was shaped like generosity, but it came from a position of new strength. And in Moravi culture, generosity from the strong was either a trap or a declaration of such overwhelming superiority that the giver could afford to lose whatever they gave. Neither possibility was comfortable. He told Teho to leave. Teho left. He did not argue. He did not press. He walked back down the corridor with the same steady pace he'd walked in with. And Kusan floated in his tank and felt all four of his hearts beating at different rhythms for the first time in decades, which was a Moravi stress response so rare it didn't have a clinical name. The meeting with Olen went differently. The speaker was 900 years old and had brokered 61 treaties and understood in the way that only the very old understand that the most dangerous thing a new power could do was refuse to behave like a new power. Teho said the same thing he'd said to Kusan. I'm here to ask what you need. Olen's harmonics went flat. That is not how this works. I know, Teho said. That's why I'm doing it this way. They spoke for 2 hours. What was said was not recorded. When Teho left, Olen sat alone in his chamber and listened to the residual harmonics his own body had left in the walls. And the pattern was one he had not produced since he was young. A frequency associated with recalibration, with learning something new after centuries of knowing everything. Teho visited all 5. Each one left the delegate changed in a way they could not articulate to their governments, which made the reports they filed afterwards vague in a manner that alarmed their intelligence services more than any concrete threat would have. The word that kept appearing in those classified reports, across 5 species and 5 languages, was the same word, translated differently each time, but pointing at the same shape. Patience. Not the patience of waiting, the patience of someone who had already finished building the house, and was now walking through it, opening doors, showing the rooms to guests who hadn't realized the house existed. 3 days after the last meeting, Baek Somi held a press conference, the first public address by a human military official since first contact. She stood in front of a display screen, aboard the Baekdu, and spoke into a translation relay that broadcast to every council species simultaneously. She declassified the lunar facility. Not the engine. The engine was already known. The galaxy had watched the Baekdu cross 9 hours of space in 4. And had spent 2 months trying to reverse engineer the physics. They'd gotten nowhere, partly because the physics were new, and partly because the physics relied on an AI architecture that the Council had made illegal for themselves to develop. Somi showed them the rest. 32 ships, a new class. They were not warships. They did not have the bristling weapon arrays that Palak dreadnoughts carried, or the sleek predatory silhouettes of Moravi interceptors. They were boxy, practical, ugly, if you were being honest, and Jihak was always honest about his children. Response vessels. Fast. Each one carried the same adaptive AI system that had herded the Krev swarm at Ret Station. Each one could reach any point in the settled galaxy within hours. Each one was a self-contained crisis response unit, able to handle natural disasters, swarm incursions, station failures, refugee evacuations. 32 ships that did not threaten anyone and could save everyone. Somi offered them to the Council, not as a human fleet, as a shared resource. Joint command, joint crew, open specifications. Any species that wanted to build more could have the blueprints. The chamber where the press conference was broadcast received this information the way the ocean receives a stone. The surface broke, and then the ripples went out and out and out, and the places they reached were very far away and very quiet. Warden Thren, watching from his quarters, pulled up the classified report he had sent to the Home Corps 7 months ago. The one that said recommend increased observation. The one they had filed and forgotten. He read it again. He closed it. He opened a new document and wrote 3 words in Palak script, which carved into stone rather than printing on screens. I was right. He did not send it. There was no point. The Home Corps would file this one too. But he kept the document open on his carving surface, and he looked at it the way you look at a mirror that has finally shown you what you suspected you looked like all along. In the Grand Forum, the Idari did something that had not happened in recorded galactic history. They moved. Not spoke, not flickered, moved. Their delegation, a single being, or perhaps a single expression of a being, no one was entirely sure, relocated from the upper gallery to the human wing of Station Kahalis. The wing that smelled like recycled air and protein bars and the faint ghost of dried kelp. The wing where the furniture was the wrong size and the lighting was calibrated for eyes that evolved under a yellow sun. The Idari settled there like light pooling in a cupped hand. No explanation, no announcement, no formal request for quarters. They simply appeared in the corridor outside Tejo's office and stayed. The information traveled at the speed of panic. Every species received it within hours. Every intelligence service on Kahalis produced an analysis. None of the analyses agreed. None of them could explain why the oldest known consciousness in the galaxy, a being that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations the way humans watched weather, had chosen to sit outside the office of a species that had been a galactic footnote 24 months ago. The theories ranged from symbolic endorsement to existential warning. The Tesserae believed it was a judgment. The Moravi believed it was a market signal. The Pali believed it was a strategic realignment. None of them asked the Idhari. None of them had ever asked the Idhari anything. That evening, Tejo sat alone in his quarters aboard the Baekdu. The ship held its orbit around Kahalis, the same orbit it had held for 23 months. The same ship, the same man, the same borrowed translation device on his desk, still clipping honorifics. He opened a personal log, the only private record he kept. He spoke into it in Korean, his real Korean, the kind the translation device would have butchered, full of the soft edges and formal distances that his language carried like heirlooms. They laughed because we were small, he said. They went silent because we listened. He paused. I do not know which frightened them more. He closed the log. He set the tablet down on his desk, next to the translation device and the clean shirt he'd worn on the day of the vote. Folded now, put away. He looked out the viewport at Station Kahalis, the ancient structure, the mineral walls, the engineered clouds visible through the observation domes, like weather trapped in a jar. Somewhere inside that station, 400 species were recalculating, rewriting intelligence briefs, sending encrypted messages home about a galaxy that no longer matched the one they had been trained to navigate. Somewhere inside, 13 minor species were sitting in their quarters and drinking their own tea and knowing, for the first time in centuries, that someone had asked them what they needed, and the answer had mattered. Somewhere inside, a being made of light sat in a corridor and waited for something it had been waiting for since before humanity learned to plant seeds. Tejo did not smile. For the first time in 24 months, his face held nothing but the truth of what it had cost to stand on that shelf, in that chamber, and be laughed at by gods, and to know, even then, even with kelp in his clothes and a broken translator on his collar, that the laughter was the last sound they'd make before the silence came. The Baekdu held its orbit. The galaxy held its breath. And in the long, ancient quiet of the Grand Forum, the mineral walls hummed a new frequency, one that no species had taught them, one that had no name in any language. That sounded if you pressed your hand to the stone and closed your eyes and listened with the part of you that was older than thought, like the sound of something very large learning to be small, and something very small learning that it never was.